Welcome to Erasing Wright. I'm your host, Eric Vogel, and this is not a Frank Lloyd Wright designed chair. It's colorful, it's quite comfortable actually, but it's not Wright. It was designed by Rietveld in 1918-1919 and received its primary colors in 1923. The question is it a chair or is it a work of art? It looks a bit like sculpture. We're going to investigate Wright's influence on the creation of this chair and on the early de-style movement and modernism in Europe. Like other episodes in this series, we're going to investigate little known, long forgotten, or just misunderstood parts of Frank Lloyd Wright's long career to see if we can find new facts or alternative perspectives behind the weedy distortions that have grown up over time. In this episode, we're going to turn our attention to early modern furniture from the first 2 decades of the 20th century, 1900 to 1919. If you want to see how modern Wright's interiors and furniture seemed to people at the time, just look across the page at the 1919 architectural record country house from New Jersey with its fashionable European features. Wright absolutely abhorred these kind of traditional styles and recommitted at the time to his search for a more modern design language, experimenting with simple abstract forms and new methods of machine production. One of his great achievements was this Taliesin armchair, seen at the top left in the Taliesin living space, a chair that's unfortunately been almost completely forgotten. Today, we're going to re-examine the relationship between the Taliesin armchair and other pieces that Frank Lloyd Wright designed in the years before World War I, and the colorful red-blue chair, which Rietveld designed in the early 1920s. Rietveld's chair might just be the most famous chair in the history of modern furniture design. Let's check out the history by giving our story some present-day context. Then we'll look back and see how Wright's furniture began to influence the early de-style movement, and in particular, Rietveld's furniture design. Recently, the Palm Springs Art Museum reopened their Architecture and Design Center with an exhibition about the modern chair. You can see the colorful forms spanning the decades of the 20th century lining the walls of their all-white galleries. What the curators are trying to do, I think, is tell a linear story about the evolutionary history of modernist furniture design. You can see Rietveld's red-blue chair at the far left, which stands at the very beginning of the exhibit as an emblem of modernist originality. It's as if the red-blue chair has emerged fully formed from thin air without any precedents to influence its creation. Fortunately, as the excellent exhibition catalog suggests, there's more to the history of early modernism than this linear exhibition design presents. In fact, there is context for Rietveld's radical red-blue chair. A figure well known to the deserts of the Southwest, Frank Lloyd Wright, played a vital role in the emergence of Rietveld's de-style furniture. It's just that you'd never know it from the way the histories of modernism always seem to be constructed. Wright's personal connection to Gerrit Rietveld through the Dutch architect Robert van 't Hoff begins our story. Thanks to new research and a book about van 't Hoff's life and work, we now know that van 't Hoff was deeply influenced by reading Frank Lloyd Wright's Chicago, or what's come to be known as the Little Wasmuth, in 1913. He went to visit Wright in America the very next year. When he got back, van 't Hoff became an important founding member of de-style in 1917 and brought Rietveld into the group in 1919. He exhibited work about his trip to America in 1918, claiming that one of his sculptures influenced early forms of the skyscraper. Like Hendrik Berlage, his mentor, who toured Europe widely, lecturing about Wright's work, van 't Hoff went to America to experience for himself Wright's buildings in Chicago, Buffalo, and Oak Park. He even stayed with Wright at Taliesin. He must have experienced some of Wright's most personal spaces and his most recent work, the interiors and furniture recently finished at Taliesin. While we don't have journal descriptions that give us van 't Hoff's exact impressions, we know that Wright's work had a profound and lasting effect on his architectural production when he returned to the Netherlands. Van't Hoff's first work in 1915 was the Villa Verloop, an undeniable tribute to Wright's small suburban houses that Van 't Hoff had seen in Oak Park. Van 't Hoff wrote several articles about Wright's work for De Stijl magazine, about the plasticity of the interior spaces and the technical aspects of Wright's architecture. With the interiors of his Villa Verloop mostly empty, Van 't Hoff and his client, J.N. Verloop, asked Rietveld if he would fabricate some reproductions of Wright's furniture to help furnish the house. We don't know how much Rietveld already knew of Wright's work, but Van 't Hoff was there to assist, lending Rietveld his own copy of Frank Lloyd Wright Chicago so Rietveld could study the photographs and make his own shop drawings. What did Rietveld learn from the Little Wasmuth book? Well, he certainly saw the relaxed open structure of the plank-sided armchairs that Wright showcased in the book. Along with the low recliners, no other furniture form is shown as often or given a more central place of honor in those interior scenes. Rietveld would also have seen this unusual side chair that Wright designed for the Roberts House living room. Look at how that backrest seems to float away from the back rail. It's like the upper parts of the chair are almost completely autonomous. Van 't Hoff and Rietveld carefully studied the prairie interiors because of a specific brief from J.N. Verloop, that's Van 't Hoff's client, to make reproductions of Wright's furniture for his new house. We have one shop drawing that Rietveld made, still left from this early commission, and the depth of his analysis is clearly visible. In fact, Danielle Baroni, who is a scholar of Rietveld, who wrote the first survey of his furniture, says that experience of studying Wright's furniture and making reproductions by hand had a lasting impact on his early development and was one of the very few cultural influences of his life. Van 't Hoff would certainly have agreed. On a visit to Rietveld's workshop in Utrecht around 1917, Van 't Hoff complimented the young designer on his Wright reproductions. But he took an even greater interest in the contemporary designs beginning to emerge from Rietveld's studio at the time. As the story goes, Van 't Hoff was so impressed that he invited Rietveld to collaborate on the interior design of a houseboat he was building, nicknamed the De Stijl. Together, they created colorful interiors and a unique side chair that Van 't Hoff designed and Rietveld fabricated, probably in 1918, based on a rocking chair from Wright's Coonley house. Today, the houseboat chair, unfortunately, only exists in a single black and white image, but the collaboration's formative role in Rietveld's development is self-evident. Within the year, Rietveld would present a new furniture series using similar joinery in an even more abstract design language. Mostly children's furniture for the Schelling family, but also a low plank-back lounge chair with a lightweight frame and distinctive Cartesian joints that we now call the red-blue chair. Rietveld's famous armchair has been represented for almost 100 years now as the seminal artifact representing the De Stijl movement and early modernism in Holland. Even when it was first published in De Stijl magazine in 1919, the armchair, as it was simply called then, was presented as an art object, like a work of sculpture, fundamentally different from any other work of the period. During the 1920s and 30s, critics and curators who were defining the new movement as modernism felt the necessity of building up the chair's originality and erasing the historical context around its production, except for Cubism and modern paintings of the De Stijl group. The more iconic that the red-blue chair became, the more necessary it was for scholars and critics and curators to diminish any precedence around the creation of the chair. In fact, Siegfried Giedion in the 1940s said that Rietveld's accomplishment was so profound because he could temporarily forget everything and begin fresh, as if no chair had ever existed before. And in 1974, Paul Poole said that the amazing thing about Rietveld's accomplishment was that he could design something as if no chair had ever existed before. Now, such insistence on pure originality without any precedence or historical context doesn't stand up long in a postmodern world. Not surprisingly, scholars today have been re-examining the sources of inspiration behind Rietveld's early development
and the creation of this red-blue chair.
In 2012, our historian Marijke Cooper, the foremost expert on Rietveld's furniture, wrote a small book dedicated to telling the complete unvarnished truth about the red-blue chair. Yet for all her research and the many details in her book, Cooper mentions Frank Lloyd Wright only twice, and in cursory ways. The real credit, she says, should go to Rietveld's teacher and mentor, Piet Claramer. She says, in fact, in no uncertain terms, and I'll quote, "The red-blue armchair followed an international trend which had been explored by Claramer, who transferred his ideas to the young Rietveld." Period, quote. End of story.
So why would some scholars work to document the deep philosophical, biographical, and aesthetic connections between Wright and Rietveld, and others completely deny the relationship? You know, one explanation might be that Dutch scholars, curators, and critics, as cultural representatives, looking and discussing an icon of international status like the red-blue chair, feel compelled to suggest Dutch sources of inspiration first. After all, the red-blue chair has become a matter of national pride.
So then, which chair does Cooper say was the big inspiration for Rietveld's radical style innovations? This bright blue arts and crafts style armchair by Piet Claramer. See how the backrest extends below the seat down to the stretchers? That's the major influence. Claramer designed the chair in 1904, which is the same year, actually, that Wright designed this slant-back chair for the Larkin Company. Actually, Wright designed his first slant-back chair 5 years earlier for the Hillside Home School in 1899. He also designed this musician's chair in 1904 for the Dana House as part of his emerging frame and plane furniture theme. When Claramer designed these chairs in 1915, Cooper singles them out as the major influence on Rietveld. And yet, clearly Wright's frame and plane theme seems to be more relevant. During this same period, Wright produced many lightweight abstract chairs, including this form for the Emil Bach House, and this even simpler side chair for the Maury Asian Art Gallery, and this furniture ensemble for the Francis Little Summer House. In these beautiful hand-colored renderings, we can see the similarities between Rietveld's furniture suite of 1920 and the furniture that Wright was developing for the Little House. Wright and Rietveld both preferred minimal, rectilinear sculptural forms.
We'll see later in the show how important this kind of volumetric framework was for Rietveld as he began to develop his ideas for style furniture in 1917 and 1918. First, let's take a look at the armchair that Wright developed for Taliesin and how it might also have been a source of inspiration for Rietveld's early development of the red-blue chair.
The Taliesin armchair of 1914 is the culmination of Wright's frame and plane furniture concept. Seen from the back, the profile of the frame is low and wide, like Wright's early prairie recliners, but the stance of the plank members above is much higher and lighter, with dimensions that are dramatically exaggerated. And look at the size and the grain pattern of that backrest. In comparison, the structural members below are just stock boards in varying widths. Notice how the primary members of the chair extend beyond their supports, except for the bottom stretchers. With that wide backrest and long arms, the chair really seems to be expanding in all 4 directions. To enhance this effect and keep the eye moving along the lines of the chair, Wright uses really subtle mortise joints that are as shallow as he could design them without a dowel. We can see the same effect in Wright's library table for the Little's Summer House of 1913. The table, like the armchair, is abstract and simple, stable, and dynamic, what Mondrian and other De Stijl members would later define as dynamic equilibrium. What we can see for ourselves is that Wright's Taliesin armchair, like Rietveld's red-blue chair, has a relaxed but monumental presence that is much greater than the sum of its humble parts. Unfortunately, the original Taliesin armchair has been lost over time. We only have 3 period photographs, one which shows that Wright was still experimenting with different configurations and proportions. Look at how the backrest changes width and position, moving forward and back of the supports. Were these chairs prototypes that Wright was testing? Another interesting thing about these photographs, which were taken in the early summer of 1915, is how much surface patina the chairs already have. If they were made in the late fall of 1914, after the fire and reconstruction, or sometime even in spring of 1915, it's highly unlikely they would appear so worn after just a few months of use. If the chairs were fabricated before the fire, which does seem likely, then Rietveld's friend and collaborator, Robert van 't Hoff, would surely have seen them when he visited Taliesin in June of 1914. We know that back in Holland, both van 't Hoff and Rietveld looked to Wright's furniture for new modes of artistic production. What they saw was Wright using lightweight frames to create volumetric spaces that were fully integrated into the structure of the chair. They saw Wright designing minimal sculptural forms with autonomous parts and simple slat or board construction that was inexpensive and could be easily produced by machine. The frameworks for the Taliesin armchair and the red-blue chair both incorporate voids that are essential and dynamic parts of the composition. Rietveld likely studied Wright's invisible joinery, those shallow mortise joints, and took it to the next level by inventing his own unique joint using hidden dowels. Clearly, Frank Lloyd Wright's frame and plane furniture provides relevant historical context, if not a direct precedent, for the genesis of Rietveld's style furniture.
We know that Wright had been working on his frame and plane furniture concept for more than a decade before Rietveld began work on his early style furniture. And yet, it's strange that curators in Holland and as far afield as the Palm Springs Art Museum deny any relationship between Wright and his early work and the development of the red-blue chair.
Wright's ubiquitous slant-back chairs were well known, widely published, and probably seen in person by Rietveld's colleagues who visited the Larkin Building, Unity Temple, and the Roby House. Photographs of Wright's Taliesin experiments with his lightweight system of frame and plane construction were published twice in Architectural Record, in 1915 and again in 1919, at the same time that Rietveld was beginning his de-style furniture innovations. Wright never wrote a manifesto like the de-style group, but these photographs were his visual declaration to the world about the importance of his new armchair and the work going on at Taliesin. The evolution of Wright's frame and plane furniture remains the unwritten chapter in the history of early modernism, one which reveals the affinity between Wright, Rietveld, and the new generation of architects and designers working in Holland at the time.
That's the end of our story. I hope you've enjoyed the episode. If so, please give us a big thumbs up and click that subscribe button below. I'm Eric Vogel, your host for Erasing Wright. Look forward to seeing you the next time. Thanks so much for joining us.